Hello, Grace Downtown family. My name is Rick Barry. I've been part of this church for over 9 years now, and later this month I'll be working with the Cultural Intelligence Ministry to facilitate a virtual class on forming relationships across partisan divides. Ahead of that class, though, Meseret asked me to share a reflection or some encouragement along the lines of what we've been getting from other church leaders over the last few weeks. Honestly, putting it together has been really hard because for the last few weeks, I've been pretty tapped out mentally and emotionally. And I know that I'm not the only one. And I know that in the church, we tend to sometimes feel guilty or inadequate when we feel overwhelmed. Like if we were good Christians, we'd be able to take everything life throws at us with a smile and a spring in our step. We tend to sometimes think that living out the gospel, experiencing the comfort of Christ, means never being seen to be worn out or beaten down. But that's not the case. That's not what we see modeled in Scripture. Scripture depicts the world as being a place filled with things that are rightfully distressing, depressing, and overwhelming. And God's strategy for dealing with that is not to deny it, not to act like it isn't there, not to try to get around it, but to acknowledge it, to name it, and to go through it. We don't see Christ deny the suffering of the people around him. We see Christ take that suffering on himself. We see him weep with those who weep. We see him overwhelmed and distressed, even to the point of death. We see him so anxious, so distressed, so overwhelmed that he ruptures capillaries in his head and blood seeps out of his pores like it's sweat. I take so much comfort in knowing that we have a great high priest. We have a king who is not a stranger to the things that feel overwhelming to us. He doesn't despise us for the fact that sometimes the things we go through are more than we can bear. The Bible acknowledges that we don't function the way we were meant to. We only see the world and understand it through a glass dimly or in part. The confidence in God, the security in his love and in his power that was meant to form the center of how our hearts and minds function, that's slippery. It doesn't stay put. The center cannot hold, and it won't hold perfectly until Christ makes us perfect. Theologians call this the noetic effects of the fall, the effects that the fall has had on the way our minds and our inner lives function. And even if we did function the way we were supposed to, even if we weren't subject to the noetic effects of the fall, the world around us does not function the way that it was supposed to. We are living in and navigating a fallen world that legitimately gives us more reasons to be anxious, more reasons to be angry, more reasons to be afraid than we were ever meant to navigate or experience, even in the best of circumstances. And this is not the best of circumstances. Scripture says that the very ground we walk on is cursed because of the fall, that all of creation is broken and groaning and waiting for the consummation of Christ, waiting to be healed and repaired. So even if we were perfect creatures, this imperfect world is more than we were designed for. We took advantage of that all the time when I was working on campaigns. We'd communicate in ways that made voters afraid of our opponent or angry at our opponent, when we could trigger the amygdala, the part of the brain that's responsible for your fear response, your stress response. When we could make people angry or afraid, we knew that's when our message would stick. But the thing Christ told his followers in the Bible, more than any other command or encouragement, was don't be afraid. The gospel writers acknowledge that Jesus said and did more than they could ever recount. And yet, he repeatedly told his people not to be afraid. He said that so often that each of the gospel writers themselves felt obligated to record him saying it many times as well. We should take comfort in that fact. It means that Christ knew, and his biographers in Scripture knew, that we would need to hear that commandment a lot. He knew that we are living in a world that makes "don't be afraid" a hard command to remember. Right now, if you're feeling overwhelmed, if you're feeling burned out and mentally exhausted, you don't have to feel guilty about that. We can turn our eyes up to Christ and tell him, "Lord, I am tired." And we can know that he will look at us and say, "I know, I understand, I don't despise you for it. In fact, I sympathize with you so much that I took on flesh just so that I could know and experience the depth of that exhaustion and the depth of that suffering alongside you, just so that you would not have to be alone in it." We serve a God who is a man of constant sorrow, who is well acquainted with grief, and who is so gentle with us that he will not break a bruised reed or blow out a smoldering wick. If we are tired right now, that's okay. The best witness we can offer is to be honest about that with ourselves, honest about it with others, and honest about it with God. We cannot be seen accepting the rest Jesus offers unless we are first seen admitting that we need it. I'm incredibly thankful that we don't have to go through this pandemic without God's sympathy. I'm thankful that we are living in a time when we can practice social distancing while still seeing the faces of our brothers and sisters in the church, still hearing one another's voices. We should be deliberate about speaking words of rest and comfort to one another in times like this. It's easy to have relationships marked by that kind of mercy and grace with people who are easy to talk to, people who are very much like ourselves. But the church is supposed to be made up of people from every tribe and tongue. If a sociologist or a pundit can look at our support networks during this time of crisis and explain them away, if they can see us bound together by anything other than the love, mercy, and power of Christ, then I really do believe Christ is calling us to grow and mature in our relationships with one another, to become better integrated into his body. I want us to have these kinds of relationships in the church with people who are on the other side of some of the biggest cultural divides, including our partisan divides. That might sound scary, but Jesus has equipped us with everything we need for it. And I do hope that we get the chance to dive into that more together on the 25th.